What's up everybody, welcome back. So in the last episode we set up our new free-for-all game mode and we have some options inside of the lobby we can set. So let's continue working on that today, and we're going to make sure that we can actually do some PvP damage, and we're going to set up different spawn points for our different game modes. So if we play our co-op game mode or free-for-all or team deathmatch, then we have a different spawn point for each game mode. So as you might have noticed, I've also changed the map a little bit. It's still not really awesome looking, but it's better than just having a flat plane, so we have something to work with. And that's going to be today's video. So if you like the series, please consider leaving a like. If you want to get your hands on the project files, you can become a member of the YouTube channel, and then you will get access to some premium channels in the Discord, and you will also get access to premium downloads in there. So with all of that stuff out of the way, let's start working on our free-for-all mode. So first of all, let's set up our spawn points, and we need to open up our gameplay map. So let's open the map and let's get a viewport in here. And we're simply going to add a prefix of the game mode to our spawn points. So first of all, let's go to the ones we already have in the level. And these are the ones for the endless wave game mode. So we're going to go to the player start tag over here in the details panel. And I'm simply going to prefix this with endless wave. And then an underscore and then the index of the player start. So let me do this for all four of them. And we need to make sure that this actually matches with the enumeration that we set up. So let's make sure that all of the capitals are right and stuff like that. So that should match with the enum. So we also want to set up the other spawn points. So that's all four of those. And now we also want to add them for our free-for-all mode. So I'm simply going to copy one of them and put them a little bit in front. Now first of all, I'm going to change the tag over here as well. So this is going to be the free-for-all 0. And then for the at the beginning, I want to place them pretty close to each other, so it's pretty easy to test things and we don't have to walk through the level all the time we want to test stuff. So I'm going to copy 4 of them over here. So they are facing each other. And then you probably want more spawn points because you don't always want to spawn at the same location, and you can give a spawn point some cooldown after you had a respawn there, so players don't spawn at the same spawn points all the time and stuff like that. So we're simply going to add another 4 of them, so we have a little bit of variation in our spawning. So I'm going to copy them and simply put them somewhere around here. And now we do need to make sure that we set up all the start tags. So we have different tags for each spawn point. So this is 0, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So let's make sure you set all of those up. That's supposed to be 6. There we go. And then the last one, 7. So we have the spawn points in the level, and that should be good to go. So let's save it. And let's continue in our game mode. So let's go to the shooter game mode. And first of all, we want to change our find start tag over here. So if we go to the event handle starting new player, and then at the end we have 2 of them for the multiplayer game and for the solo game branch. So let's do the multiplayer one first, it doesn't really matter. All we want to do over here is append a string. So let's disconnect the incoming name over here, and we're going to drag off and append a string. So then we can add 3 pins in here, and then we're going to grab our game mode from the variables, and we can simply plug that into the first string. So that will convert it. And then the B string is going to be an underscore. So simply the underscore over here, and then we're going to plug in the index of the player. So this way it will find the correct player start with the correct index. And we can do the same thing for the solo branch. So let's grab the append node and go over here. And in this case we really only need 2 pins, and we can simply plug in our game mode here as well. So the game mode goes in the A pin, and then for the B pin we can simply pick the 0 spawn point, so that's going to be _0, and then plug it into the incoming name. And that should fix the spawn points at the beginning of the level. Now we also want to set up a respawning for our free-for-all mode, because after we are dead we probably want to be able to respawn. So let's create a function that will select what respawn we're going to use. So let's go to functions and create a new one, and we're going to call this setup respawns. So this is actually not the function that picks it, but this is the function that will pick all the available spawns when the level starts. So first of all we want to set up a few local variables, or only one actually, and that's going to be the game mode string. So let's create a new variable, local game mode string, and turn it into a string. So first of all we're going to set this, so grab a setter, and we're going to plug in our game mode from our variables. So we have that stored. Then we're going to get all the actors of class, and we want to get all the player starts in the level. So get all actors of class, and we're going to get all of the player starts. We're going to grab a for each loop, so we can loop through all of them, and then we want to make sure that we only grab the ones for the correct game mode. So we're going to grab the player start tag from the array element, player start tag. So that's the name variable that we set up on the player starts, and we're going to convert this to a string, so to string, the name to string, and then in this string we're going to search for a substring. So let's drag off here and do find substring. Oh, really? So now we can plug in a substring over here, and it will search for this string inside of this string. So if we plug in our game mode over here, we can tell if this is a player start that we want to use. So we can plug in our local game mode string, and it will start the position at -1, and if it doesn't find anything it will also return -1. So we can simply grab a branch over here and plug it into our loop body. And then we want to compare this, so this needs to be greater than or equal to 0. And if this is true, then we can use this player start, or respawn point actually. So we're gonna add it to a mapping, and then we can use that mapping later to pick respawn points for when player dies. So we're going to create a new variable, and that's going to be all of our respawn points. So all respawn points. And that's actually going to be a map, and the first index is a string, the first variable type is a string, and then we're going to turn it into a map, and the second variable type is going to be a boolean. Then we're going to drag this in over here, and we want to add an element. So let's add and plug it into the true pin. So we want to add this respawn point, so we can simply grab the name. So we can grab the name from the player start tag from the toString node over here and plug it in, and we want to set it to false, so that means it's not on a cooldown and we can use it to spawn. And as soon as we spawn a player over here, we're gonna set it to true and set a timer, so for that time it won't be able to spawn another player. So that should be our setup respawns. So after we call this function, we have all the available respawn points for this game mode stored in this mapping. So now we want to go back into our event graph, and we want to actually call this function when we play the free-for-all mode. So let's go to event graph, and let's go to the end of the event handle starting new player. So we are switching on our game mode, and we have our level start free-for-all. So right after that we're going to call our setup respawn function. So let's plug it in, and that should work. So I should probably make a little bit of room over here, but I'm going to do that later, so let's not worry about that. So with this call in place, let me see, we want to set up our respawn after dying event, and we also want to set up our cooldown event. So let's do the cooldown first. Let's create a new event inside of our event graph, and let's call this something like a respawn point cooldown. And we want to give this one input, and that's going to be the respawn point. And we need this to be a string variable. So we're going to grab a delay in here. And in here you can specify how long it should take for a respawn point to cool down. So for now I'm going to set it to a fixed value of something about 3 seconds. So keep in mind, this is not the respawn time for the player to respawn, but this is the cooldown of the actual respawn point. So the same, so players can spawn directly after each other at the same respawn point. So after this delay is done, we're simply going to grab our respawn points mapping, and we're going to add one. So if we want to override an existing value in here, we also simply want to call add. So we're going to add. And we're going to plug in the respawn point and then set it back to false, so it's available for use again. So that's all we need to do in here. And with that one in place, we want to set up our respawn after dying event. So also inside of the event graph, we have our respawn after dying event. So if a player gets killed, this will be called to respawn the player. And we want to make sure that we convert this into a function, so we can set up some local variables for selecting a respawn point. So the first thing we're going to do is select all of this stuff in here, right click, and then collapse to function. So I'm going to call this respawn after dying. And let me see, so we can get rid of the actual event. And we don't need this node over here as well, by the way. So before we set this one up, let's go inside of our player controller. So that's our shooter player controller. And in here we have an event called respawn after death. And that actually makes sure that the game mode calls our respawn after dying event. So we want to look for our respawn after death event. And over here you can see the game mode calls respawn after dying, but we just got rid of that event. So we want to get rid of this call, and we're going to call our function respawn after dying. And for this one, so we need to make sure that the inputs are actually correct. So let's go back into the game mode, because when we collapsed it, it created an input for us. And these are actually the same, so we can just get rid of one of them and plug both of those in here. So let's get rid of the input pin over here, and this actually is our player controller. Compile and save. So inside of the shooter player controller, let's refresh this one and plug in the reference to ourselves. So now we're calling our function instead of our event. So that's actually fixed. And now let's go back into the respawn after dying function, and let's set this one up. So we need a bit of room in here. Let's disconnect this stuff. And the first thing we're going to do is grab our respawn points mapping, and we're going to get all keys inside of the map. So simply type keys, and this will return an array with all of the keys in here. So let's promote this array to a local variable. So promote to local variable, local all respawn points. And then we also want a local variable for our picked respawn point. So let's duplicate this one, local picked respawn point. So that's also a string, but that's a single variable. And then the last thing we need in here is a loop count. So let's add another variable, and that's our local loop count. And that's an integer. So we have all respawn points stored in our array. Then we're gonna grab a setter for our picked respawn point. So let's set it over here, and we're gonna grab a random item from our array. So let's drag off here and do random array item, plug it in over here. And then we want to know if we can actually use this respawn point. But first of all, we're gonna grab our loop count and we're gonna increment it. Plug it in over here. So if our loop count is smaller than or equal to 10, then we're going to continue. And if we loop through this 10 times or something like that, then we're simply going to break the loop and pick a respawn point. So the reason I'm adding a loop in here is because you don't do this and you have very few respawn points and all of them will return false. So it will keep looping. This will create an infinite loop and your Unreal will crash. So to prevent that happening, we're simply going to maximize the loops in here, and that should fix our problem. And if we loop through the array 10 times and we don't have an available respawn point, we're simply going to use the last one that we checked. So over here, we're going to do is smaller than or equal to, so less or equal. If it's less or equal than 10, then we're going to continue looping, and otherwise we're going to break the loop. So if this is true, we're going to grab another branch in here, and we want to make sure that we can actually use this respawn point. So to get to know that, we want to drag in our mapping, and from the mapping we can find an index in here, or an entry actually. And the entry we're looking for is the picked respawn point. And then this will return the boolean that's inside of the mapping. So it also returns a boolean if it found something or not. So that's the lower one. And the first one is the actual value associated with this key. So we need the top boolean to check if we can use this respawn point. So we're going to plug it into the condition. So if this boolean is true, that means the respawn is on a cooldown, so we cannot use it. So if this is true, we're going to loop back through the beginning and we're going to grab another respawn point. So we're going to go back to the setter for the local picked respawn point that picks a random one. So let's make sure this looks a bit better. There we go. And if this is false, then we can use this respawn. So then we want to make sure that we grab our respawn points mapping again, and we're going to add. So we want to add our picked respawn point. So this will overwrite the current setting, and we're going to set it to true. Plug it into the false pin. So this means it's in use right now and it's on a cooldown. So then we want to call our cooldown event. So let's do that as well. Respawn point cooldown. And in here we can plug in our picked respawn again. And after we did all of that stuff, then we can continue by unpossessing our pawn and spawning the new one, so we can plug in the rest of the function. Now let's make sure that we connect up our player controller again, so everything is working. So that's our player controller variable from the input. And make sure that we plug it into both of these pins. So this will pick a random respawn point and make sure that our cooldown function actually kicks in when we use it. So we don't really need to replace the calls because we already changed it inside of our player controller, so that should be set up and good to go. So the next thing we can take a look at is our PvP damage. So it shouldn't be too hard to get our damage working. We already have an interface for our damage player for when an AI damages the player. So we're going to make a few small changes in here so we can use it. So let's open up the interface and let's open up the function. In here we're using the attacker as an input, and that's set up as a BP minion base variable, and the only thing we're doing with this is getting the actor location. So we're going to change this one into the actor type, simply an actor for the attacker. And we also want to add one new input, and that's going to be is PvP damage, and that's a boolean. So this is our new interface setup. Let's compile and save it. And now let's open up our character. So that's hero base. And then the first thing we can do is go to our AI damage event. So event player take damage. And in here we could find the references and look for all of the calls to our function or interface, I'm sorry. So for the interface we change the input for the attacker to an actor, and if we check all of these calls we can make sure that everything is still working and plugged in. So we have a reference to ourselves and it actually connected, so it didn't replace the input, it simply changed it and everything is still working, so no need to worry about that. Now we want to change our event player take damage. So if we go in here we have our get damage direction event, and this one actually uses the AI minion base as an input, so we need to change this one to an actor as well. So open up get damage direction, and for the input we're going to change the input to an actor. And then we're using this to get the actor location, so this actually keeps connected and that's working. There is one side note over here. I managed to screw up this part over here, and we need to swap these two pins to make sure that the actual damage direction is correct. So right now if I'm hit from the front it will say back, and if I'm hit from the left it will say right. So to fix it we simply need to swap the pins, so the actor location from the attacker goes in the lower pin and my own actor location goes in the upper pin, and that should fix the damage direction. So we have the input changed over here and we have our boolean in place. So now we want to go into our server process hit function. So let's go to server process hit. And in here if we hit something we check if it has the BPI damage interface, and if it does it's an AI. So we're going to disconnect the false pin, and over here we're going to check for the BPI damage player interface. So does implement interface, and this time we're going to pick our BPI damage player. So if it implements this interface then it's actually another player, and we can simply call our take damage event again. So for now we're going to reuse the AI one that we already have set up. So let's grab a branch, plug it into the false pin, plug in this condition, and then we can simply call player take damage. So from the true pin, player take damage, and we can simply call our BPI interface function. And we want to plug in the target from the actor. Am I screwing this up? Okay, so let's get rid of this one and let's just drag off the actor over here, and we're going to call our player take damage. So the BPI damage interface message, and that should work a little bit better. So now we can actually plug in the target, and for the attacker that's going to be a reference to ourselves. For the hit result we can grab it over here from the input of the function. And then the damage amount we can grab it from our weapon variables. So that should be in here somewhere. Fire time damage over here, and plug it in as well. So this is PvP damage, so let's enable our PvP boolean, and then we can simply continue to the return node and plug in the false pin as well. So that should actually make our PvP damage work on our AI damage event. So we could have a quick test to see if this is actually working. So a 2-player free-for-all game ready to go. Let's start it. And we should be able to at least do damage to each other. And as you can see, we're also using our free-for-all spawn points. So we're spawning right in front of each other. And right now if I'm shooting, you can see I'm actually doing damage to the other player, so that's already working. Let's see if it's working the other way around as well, and it is. So we have the basics for the damage already set up. Now let's take a look at respawning, disable spectating, and making sure that we can only do damage in PvP modes. And then in the next episode we're going to continue by setting up scoring and the scoreboard and stuff like that. So for our co-op game mode we actually disabled respawning and we have spectating enabled. And for free-for-all we probably want to swap that around so we can respawn but we cannot spectate. So let's work on that first. Let's go inside of our shooter player controller. And in here we have an event that actually sets the boolean if we can spectate. So that's called our server is respawn enabled. So it sets the boolean if we can respawn. So let's look for that event, and that's over here. So we're getting the game mode, we're switching on the different game modes, and then we're simply setting the boolean if we can respawn or not. So we're going to create a boolean for spectating as well. So let's grab our, well, let's just create a new variable, doesn't really matter. And that's going to be is spectating enabled. And we also want to add one for the PvP modes. So let's call this is PvP mode. Now for Endless Wave, we do not want respawn enabled. We're going to set spectating enabled to true. So let's do that over here. And then we're going to grab is PvP mode, and that's going to be false. So plug those in. And we want to make sure that for the spectating one, we set it to replicate. So the server is going to be the one handling the damage, and he's the only one that needs to know the PvP mode boolean. For the spectating one, we're also going to use this on the local player controller, so we need to make sure that we replicate this one. Now we're going to copy these ones and paste them for our free-for-all game mode, plug it in over here, and in this case we want to enable respawn, disable spectating, and is PvP mode is true, so make sure that you set those correctly. Then with this stuff set up, we're going to go into our multicast begin play event, and over here is spectating is false, and we are on a local player controller. So right after we create our HUD, before the switch has authority, we're going to call this event that we just changed. So that's our server is respawn enabled. So when the player controller starts and begin play kicks in, it will actually check the game mode and set these variables. So with this stuff in place, we're going to go into our widget for the player died menu. So let's open up widget blueprint player died, go to the event graph, and in here, so on event pre-construct, we're going to our shooter player controller and we're calling our server is respawn enabled event. So right now we can get rid of this. We're not doing it when we create the menu, but we're doing it right away when the player controller spawns. So get rid of that one. And we also want to make sure that in the event construct, we actually set up the buttons. So if we go to construct over here, grab another branch, and let's plug in the true pin over here and the other branch as well. So now we want to drag off our player controller and get our is spectating enabled. So not is spectating, but spectating enabled. Plug it into the branch. And then we simply want to grab the button for spectating and the spacer. So let's grab this stuff over here, or let's grab the remove from parent. So this goes into the true pin. We want to grab our button spectate and remove it. And to make sure that it actually looks a little bit cleaner, I'm also going to remove a spacer. So let's get rid of this. So we're going to remove this button, but I also want to remove this spacer over here so it looks a bit cleaner. So I'm going to select this one and give it a name. So that's the spacer spectate button. And turn it into a variable. Compile and go back to my graph, and then I can remove this one from parent as well. So that's set up and good to go. So if we have spectating enabled, the buttons will be there, and if not, they will be removed. So we actually need to plug it into the false pin to make sure it's correctly set up. So this should work. And when working in this graph, I also noticed there is a mistake in here for the button respawn. So over here, if we click our respawn button, we're setting our isSpectating boolean, and I accidentally set it to true, and this needs to be false. So I think I messed this up in the actual video, so you might want to check in your game if this is the case as well, and if it is, make sure if you click the on respawn button, this is set to false and not to true. Okay, with that stuff in place, we can go back into our hero base character and make a few small changes, and this should actually work. So let's open up our hero base, and first of all, let's go to our event graph. So we want to look for our begin play event, and that's over here. So all the way at the end, we have an isServer branch, and the server hands out the weapons. And in here, we're going to make sure that we also set our PvP mode boolean. So I'm going to add an isPvP mode boolean to the character as well, so that we don't need to access our player controller every time we want to check it. So let's create a variable on the character, and that's isPvP mode. Then at the end of the begin play event for the server, we can grab our shooter player controller and get the PvP mode boolean from there. So isPvP mode, and then store it onto our character. So we have it in place in here. So drag in a setter, plug it in, and that should be good to go. We do not need to replicate it, that's fine. Now if we go back into our server process hit function, over here we check if we have the BPI damage player interface. So we're going to disconnect this one, grab an end node, and we also want to make sure that we actually playing a PvP mode, and then we can damage the other player. So then we can plug it back into the branch, and that should work. So right now we should have our spectating, respawning and PvP mode damage set up, so this should work. We're going to run a little test, see if everything is correctly, and then we're going to wrap it up for this video. So I ran a little quick test offline, and there's actually one thing that we forgot, or I actually forgot inside of the shooter game mode. So let's open up the shooter game mode, respawn after dying function. So first of all, we have the branch with the loop count, and we want to make sure that if this is false, then we can actually select this respawn point. So we're going to skip the next boolean and simply pick the current respawn that we're on. So let's do that first. And then we also want to go to the find player start node over here, and in here we actually want to plug in our local picked respawn, so we actually use the correct one. So let's grab local picked respawn, plug it in over here, and then we can get rid of this find node. We don't need that one anymore. So now this should work. So let's grab a 2-player game in here and let's have a quick test. So we should be able to respawn, we should not be able to spectate, and we should not be able to do PvP damage inside of our endless wave game mode. So first of all, let's test our free-for-all stuff. So we're using the free-for-all spawn points, that's good. Now let me kill this guy. So that works, I cannot spectate, but I can respawn, so let's spawn, and I'm actually spawning at a different location, so it seems to be picking a random spawn point. Let me kill the client over here. So that's working as well, and I'm also at a different spawn point. So let's kill each other a few times to see what happens. So we're picking different spawn points each time, so I think we are good to go in here. So as you noticed, when we respawn, our control rotation and the player rotation is a little bit weird, so we get this turning around. We're gonna fix that later, so don't worry, we're gonna look into that as well. So with this stuff working, we could quickly check if our PvP damage is disabled in the co-op mode. So let's do that quickly and then we're done for today. So ready up and let's start the game. So we shouldn't be able to deal damage to the other player right now, and we're using the correct spawns, so that's good. And the damage is disabled, so that's working as well. So that's today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider leaving a like, and I'll be back soon for more. Talk to you later, guys. Bye bye.